Hi there, folks. Today's lesson is going to be a two-parter. All right. We're going to be in the first part rigging up this hand, setting it up with joints and skinning it, and then in the second part we're going to be creating some custom attributes as well as some set-driven keys. All right. So we'll just jump into it. So first you'll want to change this from modeling to rigging. Right. And go into your front viewport. Hit the space bar in there. Change this to rigging as well, and activate your Create Joints tool. Now, we want to start this off at the base here of this mesh, so we can hold the X key down because it's aligned with the grid, and just drop a point there. Then we're going to hold our X key down again, and we're going to drop a point at the base of this palm. Okay, then I'm just going to take this and move it down a little bit lower, so it's more in line there. Alright, activate the Create Joints tool again. This time we're going to create a joint at the base of this little finger, and then at the tip of it, and then right click undo if it drops another point. Then hit your G key to reactivate that tool, and do the same for this finger here. So something that's kind of important is we actually only need to rig, or rather set joints down for one half of a symmetrical model if we're working on a symmetrical model. So we only have to do one half of it. Right? So typically what you'd do is you would finish up one half and then you could mirror over the joints, replacing common naming conventions such as L underscore for the left side to the R underscore for the right side. Another thing that's fairly important here is we're going to be referring to this right side of the mesh as the left. It has to do with the way that we're facing, and also the way that the palm's facing out towards the camera like that. And so you can see if you turn around to the back, this would still be the left side. You just want to make sure to keep that consistent. So we can actually probably go into our perspective viewport and just kind of push these bone ends or joint ends a little bit more into center, okay, a little bit more into place. And then you can activate the Insert Joints tool from the skeleton drop down here and drag out. Alright, but we probably want to be able to see our wireframe a little bit better, so we should do this in our front viewport. Okay, so you can drag from here out, and you want to align the center of this joint with this band of edges here. It's going to be able to, once you skin the mesh, it's going to preserve the form a little bit better once it starts rotating around. Alright, so go ahead and do that for the other hand too, or the other finger too. Alright, then we can select both of these joints here, and then select this wrist joint, and hit P to parent them. Okay, so if we look at this in the perspective view, everything should still be pretty much aligned. Now, if you're having a hard time with the draw size of your joints, you can manipulate that through this radius slider here. Right? So in our case, we might want something like 0.25. And you'll just go through each joint in the chain and change those as you need to. I think I like the size of the wrist and palm there, so I'm just going to leave those. Okay, so now we have to start naming stuff. So this one can be something like arm underscore JNT. Oh, a spelling error there. And then wrist underscore JNT. Now, if you remember that underscore JNT just stands for joint, it makes it a little bit easier to see in the outliner when we're looking through the hierarchies. Okay. This one here will be L underscore little finger 01 underscore JNT. And then you can just copy this so that you don't have to type it all in a second time or third time or however many times as far as these joints in the chain go. Alright, so what's important is this last bone here, this last joint, it should have a different suffix attached to the end of it. So this one is going to be underscore BE for bone end. Okay. Then we're going to do the same thing for this larger digit here. So L underscore large finger 01 underscore JNT. And just copy that and confirm it. This will be 02, and then just as the other digit there, we'll make this 03. And then this last one will have the underscore BE. Alright, so once you're happy with that, we can start mirroring over these joints. Okay, so we'll select, we have to select them one chain at a time, so unfortunately we can't select both of these and just mirror them across. We have to do it once, one at a time. So you can select that base joint that you want to mirror over, go to skeleton, and you'll see mirror joints. You can open up that little dialog box. Now by default the behavior is across X and Y, which if we hit apply we'll see, well, it kind of just flips it the wrong way. So we want to do Y and Z. Y is the up, Z is the forward, so it'll reflect across that side. Okay. The other thing here is that you want to search for that L underscore that's in the name of the joint and replace it with R underscore for the other side. Okay, so then you can just hit apply, and you can select this larger finger and apply again, and then close this out. So now we're at the point where we ought to be all set to start skinning this. So we'll grab the base joint, which is that arm joint, and we'll select the hand mesh, go to skin, and then bind skin. Right. So if you wanted to take a look at this dialog box here, what we're seeing, we're binding to the joints in the hierarchy. Okay, we're going by the closest distance. Right. Weight distribution, you might want to change that to neighbors here. Okay, so the reason for that is these joints will have a fall off radius, right? That's what that drop off rate is. Okay, and it's going to go out a certain distance, and it's going to check that if the weight distribution is set to distance, it'll only work off that distance. With neighbors, it'll work within the distance, but only take into account geometry that can be closely attached to the area that you're trying to influence. Okay, we'll also want to change our max influences to something like 4. Alright, and we'll just hit bind skin. So, oh, it looks like I made a mistake here. I forgot to pull this wrist back. So, in order to unbind the skin, you can select the mesh, go to skin, and unbind skin. Then you can select, say, the base joint, and we can activate our insert key. We'll select both of these joints and just drag them back a little bit. Likewise, we might want to do that with these larger digits as well. Let's just pull them a little bit back. Better yet, we'll add a little bit of a curve to each one of these. Now this part isn't super important. I'm just kind of straightening things out a little bit more. Right. So now that looks good. So now that that's done, we can select that arm joint, select the hand, go to skin, and bind the skin. So now, we should see, just by default, now we can start moving things around. I'm going to undo that. Okay, so we do have the ability to start moving these joints, however, the way that they're deforming is not quite perfect. Okay, so in this next part, we're going to be skinning this mesh, right? And the way that we do that, you can select it, go to skin, and paint skin weights. Now if you double click that, or if you just hit the box about here, you'll open up these tool settings, which will allow you to select the entire joint hierarchy. Okay. So one thing that's important, you only need to weight paint 1/2 of this model. So because it's symmetrical, we have the ability to mirror over our skin weights. So that can alleviate some of the workflow for us. So with that being said, it's time to start assigning these influences, and I'm looking at the arm joint, and that looks like it makes sense. Black is no influence, and white is full flush of influence. If it makes sense to you, in another way, you can use this color map, or this color ramp, and you can kind of see like a thermal vision type thing. Right? So we have a couple paint modes, or paint operations rather. We have replace, which will take any value and try to give it this maximum value here. You have add, which will slowly add to it over time. Right, so the more you brush across it, the more it'll add to it. And then we have smooth, which will blend some of these values out. Okay, so it'll blend these together. Now with this arm joint, we probably want to have this joint fully control this bottom area of the arm. So what we're going to do is we're just going to replace with a value of 1. Just kind of paint over that area. Now because this is a soft brush, I'm seeing it's taking a little bit of time for me to actually fill in these spots here. Right? If you want to fix that, you can use either this hard brush here in this profile or the square brush. Square might be a little too much. So we can bring down the size of this brush by holding down the B key, B as in boy, right? And then left click and dragging, and that will make this this fall off area larger or smaller depending on what you're trying to do. So again, just going back through and trying to assign full value to this half here. And then we can just kind of blend these areas out. If you hold your shift key down, that will activate your smooth tool, right? Additionally, if you wanted to get rid of influence, you hold control down with a hard brush. Keep your value at 1, and you can completely remove any influence that you have there. Right, so remember, we only have to actually weight paint one side, so don't get too hung up. Right, we'll go to this wrist joint, and let's see, you can go ahead and remove this influence here. Now what'll end up happening, and as I'm sure you probably saw, it will reassign that weight to whatever joint is closest. Okay, so if I were to completely remove that too, see in this arm joint that now we have that red section has crawled up a little bit, right? Maybe what you're going for, may not be. I think this wrist is okay. So going with this large finger, and what you're seeing is a bunch of extra weight that shouldn't be around that area. So we just have to do a little bit of cleaning up and paint away areas that don't make sense for this. Mainly what you're looking to do here is just give yourself as much influence as you can in the areas that you need it. So you'll see the darkest color here is in between this joint because you want it to have the most influence there. Right? We don't want it to affect any of these finger digits up there. So we can just paint away those values. However, we do want to retain some strength up here. Right? So we can add to that maybe some small amount, and then kind of smooth it. Smooth out those values. Okay, go back to replace, pull out some more of this. Alright, so this is kind of the process here. I'll probably speed this up so that we can just kind of get through it. I don't want to completely get rid of the influence under here, but do not want it to control as much as it is. Alright, so large finger O2. Come in, same exact thing. Just kind of get rid of those influences where they ought to not be. Right, we don't want it to control that bottom section at all. Squish this up. Oop. Something you should know is that the replace tool will, when you hold the control key down, will place 1 minus your value. Okay, so a full value of 1 minus your value. So it'll paint the difference of whatever value you are currently using. Right? So that's something that you want to pay close attention to as you're rigging, as you're doing your skinning, rather. And I want to bring your attention to this BE here. So we actually don't want this joint to have any influence over the mesh at all. Okay, it's essentially just telling the deformation like where to stop. Okay, so we have this offset here, and we know that the end is going to come down according to the rotation of this last bone. So we don't actually need to have any weights assigned to the BE. Okay, just double check that. I'm just going to do a last look on these digits here. See, these are probably fine. So the next step is to go to this little finger. Again, we're seeing a bunch of influence that we don't need. Now, because of the way that the pinky kind of scrunches down, we're going to want to give it a little bit of influence across the back of this palm here. Back of the hand, rather. Then to remove it from any part that doesn't quite make sense. This can be a time-consuming process. Okay, that's normal. It's normal for it to take a little while. And then, kind of as the last thing you do, you just kind of blend that back together. And if you need to add anywhere, we'll be able to check that once we're finished here. Again, remember this BE, we don't want that to have any influence, so check to make sure that it has none. Then we'll go back through our chain to make sure that everything is as it ought to be. Maybe we add a little bit here. Okay, so once you finish this part, we can do what's called a wiggle test. Okay, and a wiggle test is basically a few frames that you put down just to double check that your deformations are occurring the way that you want them to. So, for instance, we could take this palm and rotate it over, copy this frame, paste it, and have it go in the other direction. Okay, and that's the S key to place a frame. Okay, and then you can just paste again back to that neutral value, and then maybe bring it forward. And then back. We're already seeing some issues here, right? Okay, well, we'll bring that back. And then at frame 70, once that motion's done, we'll start moving around these fingers here. Yep, so once again, we got that stray issue. Okay, and so we'll paste that back up. Now what we can do is we can go back to this mesh, we can go back to our paint skin weights, and on any frame, we're still able to paint these values in. Okay, so I can take a look here and say, well, that doesn't look quite right. So the issue is probably something to do with the weighted influence over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull this over and come back, right? So we go to the right and we have that issue. Okay, now because it's on that left side, I'm not too concerned about it. We are going to be mirroring over our weights after anyway. But it looks like the finger may be moving that part of the joint there. So let's go back to this little finger, and yep, that's exactly what happened. We have a bunch of extra weight here that we weren't accounting for. So we can just paint that away. Alright, so now we're looking here. For some reason that's being pulled. Some other joint, it looks like the wrist is pulling that. So now we just go through and we can start removing some values. Head on back to another frame where it makes sense. Okay, and then just kind of pull those or remove the influence from these areas. So now when it comes down, it should be a little bit nicer of a bend. Okay, we do want the finger to have a little bit more strength than that. Right, so we'll go to that little finger. We don't want it to curl up as much. So maybe instead we want the wrist and we want to add some slight values to this. So when you have influence on another bone, and say one, or joint rather, right, you have influence on one joint, and you go to rotate it, it's going to be trying to average out the position based off of those influences. So more than one joint, or more than one joint controlling an area, will actually allow you to keep it a little bit more in check. So go back to this large finger, or the little finger, and just kind of start adding in here. That's already looking much better. Maybe we'll smooth this out. I'd say that's not so bad. Maybe fix some of that pinching, but overall this will work. Okay, it is normal sometimes for your mesh to intersect on itself, though it's not happening here. Just be aware if you don't have the geometry, you have to work within the limitations of what you have. Alright, so at frame 80, I'm going to put a frame down. 90. This is getting rotated. Again, we see we need to adjust these influences here. So we will select that hand, go back to our weight painting mode, look at little finger 02, try to figure out a way we can make it behave a little bit more nicely. I'm thinking if we remove some influence here, we can turn down our opacity to minimize this effect. But if we remove some influence around here, feeling it's not going to bunch up on itself as much as we were seeing. Alright, so let's take a look. Okay, that's a pretty nice bend. So this last bit is to just rotate this right here. So we'll take that and place a key down. And at 110, rotate it. And then copy this key and paste it right back at the end. So again, we probably need just a little bit more influence in through here. Okay, so what we're going to do, we'll go back to our weight painting, to this little finger here. Okay. So we're seeing that that bottom one, that bottom edge loop is not moving, where the top one is moving too much. So let's go ahead and just paint out some of those values. We'll get rid of some influence in through here. Make that bend work a little bit more nice. Just remember, your end result is only going to be as good as the amount of time that you spend blending. Okay, so if you need a smoother transition, by all means take the extra time to go and do that. If not, you're probably okay with what you got right there. Okay, then we do the same process for this part of the hand here. Okay, so we want to do that for the large finger as well. And so we'll start with our wiggle test. All right, so we come back on 70. We know that that digit is okay, so we'll take that, and frame 80, we'll just bring that down. Copy, and paste that right back. So we can get a look at this. And there's something weird happening here. Okay, so we can open up our tool settings again. We'll go to the large finger 01, and we'll just kind of smooth out that area there. It doesn't need to be half as strong as it is. Maybe we'll pull some of this knuckle back. So something seemingly has control over this area here. And it might be the wrist, but I'm not entirely sold on it, so I'm going to look at this finger 02 and try to give it some more value. Okay, so just going to add that area in. So that's probably going to have to be painted out anyway, so we'll turn that opacity up and remove that influence. It's hanging around there. We'll turn the opacity back down and replace with this lighter value. Seeing it's kind of tugging on it, so we don't want to remove anything there. If anything, we probably want to remove it here. Alright, so back to that wiggle test. Right? So frame 90, it's back up. So now I'll bend that, hit S, copy this, paste it back. Okay, and we can change this timeline. So it's not going to end at 120 anymore, we can do it at 160. So let's take a look at that deformation, and it's not quite ideal. Not quite ideal. So we can go back to our skin weights. Okay. We'll open up those tool settings, and we'll figure out a way to blend this back together. So turn down that opacity, hold control, and it'll start painting away influence. So why don't we add a little bit to this large finger 01? And that's pulling away too much detail. So what can we do here? Right? Well, if that's the case, odds are we just need to up our values a little bit. maybe smooth out this area too. So it doesn't have to be perfect. You know, it's just something that gets the job done for our purposes. Okay, back to that wiggle test. Alright. So as far as the deformations go, most of these are pretty good. So what we got to do next, okay, and it's part of the reason why it was important to just put that key down originally, so we can just go right back to this original state here. What we're going to do is we're going to select all the vertices, okay, and if you end up selecting these joints, just go to Show, Joints, and turn that off. Reselect these vertices. Go up to Skin and Mirror Skin Weights. You can hit that little dialog box. So we want YZ, and because we're working across the negative, right? Actually, why don't we test this? So we can put down a cube and just push it that way. And so we do want it to go positive to negative, so the positive side across the negative side. Okay, so Skin, Mirror Skin Weights, positive to negative. We're going to change this to 1 to 1, and then the second influence is going to be closest joint. So if it's not 100% symmetrical, it'll go to the next closest thing. Alright, so then you can hit Mirror, and we can show our joints again. We'll go back to Object Mode, and this should have all the same weights across both sides now. Still probably have a little bit too much on that wrist. You know, could use a little bit of extra blending, but overall it's not too bad. Okay, so let's say that you have, and I'll just delete that for the time, say you've outdone your undos, so you can't go back anymore, but you have all these rotations and everything. Well, you can just select your skin, go back up to Skin, and go to Bind Pose, and that will reset it back. Okay. So that's it for the skinning. I know it was pretty long, but this was the end of part 1. So now you should know how to make a symmetrically mirrored skeleton, as well as to mirror your vertice paints, weight painting techniques. So yeah, I think we're in a good spot to call it here.